Skeptics tell us that one of the reasons that we can't trust the Gospels is that they make so many historical errors. In particular, the evangelists tell us of some far-out tales that aren't corroborated by any other contemporary historians. One of those weird stories is the darkness that happened during Jesus' crucifixion, which is recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Here's Mark's account. He writes, "And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. Now, we know from history that historians like Pliny and Seneca have carefully described much less exciting events in the same kind of remote regions. And yet, they fail to note any eclipse occurring in Judea. What's up with that? Pliny the Elder wrote an entire book on natural history, so how could he have missed this? The first thing that we need to note here is that this is an argument from silence, and arguing from silence is always a poor way to make your point. In 79 AD, Herculaneum and Pompeii were destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. We learn about it from Pliny's nephew, Pliny the Younger, and it wasn't in any of his histories, but actually in a personal letter to Tacitus. The eruption killed anywhere from 16 to 60,000 people, but nobody draws from silence of other historians that the event didn't happen. We obviously have plenty of archaeological evidence that it did. Regarding the relative weakness of arguments from silence, Dr. Tim McGrew doesn't mince words. He writes, "Such arguments from silence are pervasive in New Testament scholarship, but they are tenuous at best. It is a risky business to speculate upon the motives of authors for including or omitting various facts. To create an appearance of inconsistency by this device is methodologically unsound. So why would Pliny or Seneca fail to report the eclipse? Well, neither of them lived in Judea or near Judea during the time of Jesus. And we're not even sure what the darkness was. Was it a solar eclipse or some other natural or supernatural occurrence? Pliny does write in great detail about other natural events, but he doesn't go into very much detail at all about eclipses. There's a one-sentence chapter on the topic in natural history, and here's what it reads. Unusually long, portentous eclipses of the sun also take place, as when Caesar the dictator was slain, and in the war against Antony, the sun remained dim for nearly a year." Well, this isn't exactly what you'd call a full history of strange periods of darkness throughout the Roman Empire. Critics who appeal to Pliny are really overstating their case here. As it turns out, historians also weren't so silent about this darkness that happened during Jesus' crucifixion. Now, I'll be the first to admit this isn't an ironclad confirmation of the event, but it is very interesting. There's an obscure 1st century historian by the name of Thallus. Like many historians of that time, his works have been lost over the ravages of history. But in one of his surviving fragments of a 3rd century Christian historian Julius Africanus, Julius makes an offhand reference to Thallus. Julius writes, "In the 3rd book of his history, Thallus calls this the darkness of an eclipse of the sun, wrongly in my opinion. Julius argued this would have been physically impossible due to the timing. It just wasn't a time for the eclipse that year. Many scholars agree that Thallus was writing in the 50s, so this would be the earliest reference to Jesus outside of the New Testament, and it's before when Mark is traditionally dated. Here's what the critics have to say, though. They argue that it isn't clear that Thallus was referring to the time of Jesus' crucifixion. This is just Julius's interpretation. Moreover, if Thallus was referring to the time of Jesus' crucifixion, the source of this information may have just come from Christian tradition. If so, Thallus was just providing a natural alternative for what was reportedly being said by the early church. So it's argued that Julius's reference to Thallus can't be taken as independent historical confirmation of what happened in the Gospels. That said, I have to say it does seem unlikely that a Roman historian would take this claim so seriously if it had absolutely no basis. Christianity was just a tiny sect at the time, so for him to respond with such seriousness suggests that he did believe it to have actually happened and that it was necessary to provide a naturalistic explanation. He would have just denied the event if he had no knowledge that it actually happened. Also, why did Julius Africanus argue that Thallus mistakenly interprets the event? Historian Maurice Gogel remarks, "If Thallus had been writing simply as a chronographer who mentions an eclipse which occurred in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius, Julius Africanus would not have said he was mistaken, but he would have used this as evidence to confirm the Christian tradition." Tertullian, writing in 197 AD, says this event also was in the Roman archives. Maybe he was referring to Thallus' writings. It's a very interesting question. Tertullian wrote, "In the same hour too the light of day was withdrawn, when the sun at that very time was in his meridian blaze. Those who were not aware that this had been predicted about Christ no doubt thought it was an eclipse. You yourselves have the account of the world portent still in your archives." Tertullian does mention Thallus by name in the same work in his Apologies. It takes a lot of guts or a lot of stupidity to challenge skeptics to look into the archives to corroborate this event if it didn't happen. For these reasons, it seems more probable than not that Thallus' comment can be taken as the earliest evidence that we have for Jesus outside of the New Testament, and it's an early confirmation of something that happened during Jesus' crucifixion. For skeptics not to give this evidence some mention seems a little too convenient if you ask me.